Hello and welcome to our fourth Talk at 10 of 2021, live from our studio in the heart of West London. This morning's programme marks the launch of WLB's Race to Zero West London campaign, ahead of the UK hosting the COP26 summit this autumn. On Tuesday, Prime Minister Johnson announced the UK will cut our emissions by 78% compared with 1990 levels by 2035, a legally blinding pledge that includes international aviation and shipping emissions for the first time. This raises the bar from the UK's previous goal of cutting emissions by 68% by 2030. And it compares with a commitment from the EU to cut emissions by 55% by 2030, and China's pledge to be carbon neutral by 2060. What a lot of numbers. Our expert panel are going to help us try and navigate these this morning as we explore what obstacles remain with regards to infrastructure and key sectors of industry as West London strives to accelerate our transition to net zero and contribute to this hugely ambitious new UK target. My panellists today are Juliane, Caillouette Noble, Managing Director at the Sustainable Restaurant Association, Simon Child, Director at Child Graddon Lewis Architects and Design, Mark Frost, Director at Fern Consulting and also Chair of the Transport Planning Society, and Jane Mossman, Project Manager at Better Futures Plus here at WLB. Throughout the programme, my colleague Rowan will be monitoring your questions, so please keep them coming in as always via the YouTube chat window, as well as by email. As always, don't forget the West London Business Support Helpline remains open throughout office hours on 020 8607 2500, ready to take your calls on any coronavirus challenges that you are presently facing in your business. Our Talk at 10 webcasts are kindly supported by Better Futures, London's flagship programme to create a clean tech cluster in the capital. So, let's get down to business. On the programme today, we're going to be covering, first of all, Race to Zero, West London, and what the campaign is all about. Then we're going to spend some time exploring transport infrastructure and modal shift particularly, and what is in store for us there in the years ahead. And finally, we're going to get two sector-based perspectives, looking both at sort of architecture and construction, as well as hospitality and the sort of restaurant space particularly. But before I dive into that first theme of the morning, I'd like to put a question I asked most of my Talk at 10 panels, and that is, what does it feel like out there on the ground at the moment, folks? Have you managed to get back to your favourite pub or cafe over the past few weeks, or are there concerns around this new variant starting to sort of play on your mind? I'm going to turn, I think, first of all to Juliane for your thoughts on what it currently feels like out there.
Yeah, well, from our perspective, working with hospitality restaurants, it's a very exciting week that we've started to see places opening up. I feel personally that it's exciting when you can see people coming back to life outside of restaurants, enjoying hospitality again. I think perhaps, slight concerns, I guess, about how this all plays out and moves forward. But in general, I think it's a very exciting step into hopefully a very nice summer when it comes to hospitality.
Yeah, no, certainly as I've nipped out this week on my bicycle and spent a few hours sat outside local cafes, you can see the sort of energy on the streets of West London as everyone tries to find that outside time. Mark, what's it been like for you and your family over the past few weeks?
Yeah, it's been great, particularly when the kids have gone back to school. That's been a real relief for them as well as for us. I've enjoyed a number of pub beer gardens. I even have a yurt booked this weekend, which is incredibly exciting. But maybe even more exciting, I have my first face-to-face business meeting. There's a group of us meeting in a cafe in central on Friday, and it'll be the first time I've had a face-to-face, I think, in several months. So it feels like it's coming back online.
Brilliant. So glamping in store for the Frost family. Jane, what's it felt like where you are?
Yeah, I think I can mirror everyone's sentiment here. We are waiting patiently for the call to go and get our vaccines, and we're actually just really looking forward to seeing our friends again in person. I think we have a work social booked in a couple of weeks, so it will be really nice to meet everyone in person as well. So yeah, really excited that it's opening up.
And have you been creeping out a bit more over the past week or so, despite not yet being vaccinated?
Do you know what? I made it on the first night out at the local pub down here in Wye in Kent, and it has never been that busy in the entire time I've been in the UK.
Brilliant. Well, that's good to hear. Simon, for you and your colleagues, what's the past few weeks been like?
I think it's quite a sort of mixed picture, as Mark related to. I think all the parents are very relieved. The schools are back and they've got some time back to themselves and to some work, but also the appreciation of flexible working, which obviously we're offering, but most businesses are now offering. So that helps them, with all their family. Anyone younger than 30. They're out there, they're enjoying it, they can't wait to get back into the office. I think on the property side, certainly on the private side, a lot of business is done socially, and all our sort of private property clients, they're already out socialising, exchanging information, trying to work out what the market is going, and that's obviously happened since the 12th of April. So that's positive. I think the other thing on a bigger picture, M&G now opening up their property fund is something that the private property industry is looking at with interest to see how people react to that, because that will obviously bring back commercial investment into the UK and into London.
As you say, very, very encouraging marker, that bit of news, and what a pleasant change, I have to say, to have so much good news on relating to COVID at the top of the hour today. Well, I'm going to move us into our first sort of theme of the morning, and that is to understand better the Race to Zero West London campaign, as this programme marks the launch of our engagement in what is a global effort, also of course supported by the UK government, throwing its weight behind it in the run-up to hosting COP26 this autumn. Jane, I wonder whether you can tell us a bit more about the campaign, and also the microsite that West London Business is launching this morning.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. The Race to Zero is a global campaign to rally leadership and support from the business community for a healthy, resilient, zero carbon recovery, and West London Business are joining the Race to Zero campaign to help build momentum ahead of COP26. We are encouraging as many local businesses as possible to set science-based targets and to commit to achieve net zero carbon emissions. And we are very excited to announce.
I'm going to interrupt you briefly, because we're going to bring up on screen a bit of a snapshot of the website, which has lots of pins in it on a map of West London.
Yes, yeah. This is our microsite, which is jam-packed with useful resources, so that businesses can find out what they need to do and the right tools to do it. And this is a map of businesses that have already pledged to reach net zero. So we are asking any businesses that have already set targets to get in touch so that we can help promote them and support them in their journey. On our microsite, we have a carbon footprint calculator that businesses can download and use. There is a sustainability tools guide, which has definitions, links to sector-specific calculators, and lots of information on how to achieve net zero. And We have lots of directories of sustainability consultants and clean tech and circular economy products and services.
So jam-packed full of info, and hopefully really easy for folk to find, because it's westlondon.com/race to zero. I don't think we could make it simpler than that. So one for everyone to hopefully note down and take a look at off the back of today's programme. Now, buried within the microsite, I think one of the actions that we're encouraging SMEs to take a look at is the SME climate commitment. Can you tell us more about what's in that?
Yes, so the climate commitment is part of the SME Climate Hub, which is a global initiative to support millions of SMEs as they make their commitments. They ask that SMEs commit to halve greenhouse gas emissions before 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. And when businesses commit, the Climate Hub helps them with tools, advice, and keeps them up to date with new developments.
And I think whilst we're still working through the practicalities, the theory is that as West London businesses start to sign up, we hope en masse to the SME climate commitment, we'll be able to track who they are, and we'll start to add their pins to our map, so it becomes full of pledges. Brilliant. Now, Simon and yes.
Sorry, we're hoping the map will be completely full.
Indeed, that's the ambition, and it would be wonderful if we had more businesses in West London than any other part of the UK, sort of striding out in that direction in the months ahead. Now, I wonder, Simon and Juliane, what's your take on this sort of move towards more sort of science-based targets across a whole variety of sectors? Does the SME sort of climate commitment feel like a realistic ask? Simon, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, I know. I think it is realistic in terms of it's achievable, but it needs the science-based facts for people to understand where they are now and where they need to get to, and that it is achievable. And I think I've got a slide later on about a particular organisation trying to identify the areas that they can immediately make improvements on. Whether that's in terms of energy or fabric or just operational use, and certainly those science-based facts are essential for SMEs to understand where they need to go first, I think.
And I think we're just going to bring up on screen now the RIBA's 2030 sort of climate challenge, which is, I think, in a sort of similar spirit, isn't it, to the SME commitment. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, I think what the RIBA are trying to stress is that to reach the sort of net zero by 2030, buildings, certainly new buildings, have to be designed by 2025, because obviously there's sort of a 5-year program for certainly larger projects. So those targets give you an example of the power energy requirement of a residential or commercial use now of about 105 kilowatt hours per square meter, reduced to 35 for the 2030 targets. So, and then similar on the commercial. And then the other big issue with development is this embodied carbon. Obviously, embodied carbon is something that, if you buy steel from China, that's not as good as buying, say, steel from the UK, or should you buy steel at all? So actually how a building is maintained, and the embodied carbon is part of the calculation that all new projects adopt in order to get to carbon zero.
So quite a complex mix of decisions, which I think you're going to unpack for us a bit more later in the hour. But clearly a very positive signal from your professional body. Juliane, what's your take on the SME commitment from a hospitality sector perspective?
I think it's absolutely achievable and absolutely necessary. However, I think it's really, really key that we make it as simple as possible for hospitality to achieve. I think sometimes hospitality, particularly smaller businesses, can be quite intimidated by words like science-based targets and some of the numbers that are thrown around. We have to remember that hospitality businesses are people first businesses. They're people that don't like to be in front of computers. They don't like they're in it for entirely different reasons. And so I think it's really essential that we start to translate what all of these things mean tangibly for hospitality and give really specific sector advice that makes it simple for them to set the targets. I think that everybody's coming off the back of an extremely difficult year. And I think what's exciting about it is it does bring to the forefront more than ever before how important tackling some of these big issues is. But I think let's work together to make it as simple as possible.
No, I think very, very sound reflections there, and I suppose an opportunity. We've probably overused this notion of building back better now, but as we do sort of restart and gear up many of our businesses, if we can do that in new ways, that's got to be a positive. Now, Jane, stepping back from the Race to Zero campaign, can you tell us a bit more about the sort of breadth of work being done across West London today to reduce emissions and combat climate change, including, I think, the launch also today of our Better Futures Clean Tech Companies Directory?
Yes, so West London Business is working collaboratively across West London's 7 boroughs on a number of initiatives that align with their pledges to reach net zero and help strengthen the West London supply chain and make it as sustainable as possible. First of all, we are a key part of the London West Innovation District, which is the Silicon Valley of aviation, working to revolutionise and accelerate a low-carbon aviation industry. We are also driving low carbon in film through Screen Capital West. I already mentioned our Race to Zero campaign. Through the West London Business Awards, we provide inspirational case studies for other businesses to follow. And finally, we support innovation in clean tech through Better Futures. And we are currently launching the Better Futures Plus program to help businesses pledging to reach net zero by 2030. And the Clean Tech Directory is through the Better Futures program, and it is linked to on our Race to Zero page.
And I think we're going to bring up on screen a sort of a visual of gives just a flavour of some of the amazing companies that have gone through the original Better Futures program. Do you want to tell us, are there any that particularly stand out for you as favourites, if favourites are allowed?
Yes, of course. So Better Futures has been around for 4 years and we have over 150 businesses. And I think one that stands out to me is Magway, who have designed underground e-commerce using electromagnetic shoots. It's really amazing. It's really technologically advanced, and it's an exciting business to watch.
And I think they're hoping to get their first route will be a West London line, which we're obviously very, very enthusiastic about at West London Business, to try and get some of those HGVs and vans off the road and moving those smaller items through the Magway system. And you touched upon Better Futures Plus there. I think again you may have a slide, and I just wonder whether you can tell us a bit more about what's involved in Better Futures Plus.
Yes, so building on the success of the Better Futures program, Better Futures Plus is working with 12 London-wide businesses who are pledging to reach net zero by 2030. They get 2 forms of support. One form of support is through a carefully selected environmental consultant that can give them bespoke environmental advice. And the other side is the Leonardo Centre at Imperial College Business School. They've developed a cutting-edge executive leadership program, which all the 12 businesses can take part in.
And I think it's a case of watch this space over the next few days for a sort of announcement on exactly who those 12 businesses are in the pilot program. Is that right?
Exactly. 12 businesses.
News to come.
Yes, across 4 sectors.
News to come very soon.
Yes, exciting.
And those 4 sectors, remind us?
The 4 sectors are film, the creative industries, food, and hospitality.
And I think the hope is that if this pilot goes to plan, we'll then be ramping up the programme sort of from the summer, and you'll sort of be reopening for new businesses to apply to participate.
Yes, exactly. That is the ambition. And we're hoping to expand it to include a lot more businesses across London so we can help drive that shift, the momentum to net zero.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you for that overview. Loads going on there, Jane, and plenty for our partner businesses to be getting involved in. Now, of course, the backdrop for all of this is, as well as at an individual company level, there is much broader infrastructure change that's going to have to be pulled off in the years ahead. Jane, you've given us a flavour of that when mentioning sort of Magway, because transport, of course, makes up some 16.2% of our emissions globally, and has overtaken power as the biggest emitter in the UK. I think we're going to bring up a slide from the most recent report of the UK Committee on Climate Change, who in December of last year sort of set out what they think our sort of balanced net zero pathway needs to look like over the coming years. And I suppose particularly relevant to us, and with some very striking reductions in their carbon emissions, relevant to our conversation today: surface transport, manufacturing and construction, waste, electricity supply, buildings, agriculture, and you know, it's more than 80% the reduction that is being called for between now and 2035 in surface transport. So I'm delighted we've got Mark with us today, who's going to try and help us figure out how we're going to pull that off. Now, you've been involved for many years on the front line of building out new low carbon infrastructure, Mark, but the political backdrop isn't an easy one. I mean, we've just seen, I think, in the past few days, news coming out of Harrow that potentially, following a review and consultation with residents in the borough, that cycle lanes and low traffic neighbourhoods might have to be removed just 6 months after they've been installed. So, given this difficult political backdrop, what do you see as the greatest barriers to net zero transport emissions in West London?
It's obviously a very timely question, Andrew, and it's one that is really worrying, I think, the sector and practitioners. I mean, the thing about transport is it's very much on the naughty step here. So you've seen emissions from energy in particular plummet in the UK over the last 20 or so years. Emissions from transport, pretty much exactly the same as where they were in 1990. They haven't really gone down at all. About, as you say, about 28% of the UK emissions comes from transport. Emissions from transport from cars actually went up in the last 5 years. So even though we've had all of these lovely EVs coming on the street, there are a lot more EVs every year in the UK. I think it was something like about 2% of new cars were electric vehicles, and about 20% of them were SUVs. So we've got a very massive challenge around getting people to move away from the use of the private car as a means of going about their day-to-day business, and that really is the heart of the challenge. What we've seen in the last 12 months in West London and indeed the whole of the UK was an attempt, I think, to try and start that process. It was necessary to try and react to the very specific circumstances of the pandemic. But to be honest with you, the greater business case lies in this, trying to get this behaviour change to move away from private car. So we definitely do need to look at our own behaviour, consider how that plays into this wider piece around Race to Zero, and be able to communicate that effectively to a very wide group of people. And I think the challenge that we've seen, and you mentioned the Harrow example there, and we've had a very similar exchange in Sutton, and a number of other boroughs have also removed these measures, is that people are not making the links between what happens with their day-to-day behaviour and how they get around, how they've always got around in the last 20 years, and how we need to change to meet the new reality of the Race to Zero.
And these are really tough habits to change, aren't they? I mean, I've recently welcomed a small baby into the world, and that puts different pressures on a young family in terms of how you get to and from a hospital and GPs and grandparents and all of the rest of it. I have to say we haven't yet succumbed to buying a car. We remain members of a car club, and in fact in the past 10 months we've invested in an e-bike. What's your take on e-bikes, Mark? I refer to the e-bike as my lazy bike. For when I'm a bit tired or I need to go a long way.
Well, I mean, I think a personal reflection on an e-bike is that when you're on an e-bike, it's like all of the really most fun moments of cycling all the time. So when you're going downhill with the wind behind you, the sun in your face, might not be so much due to the motoring of the cycling, but all the bits that make cycling really good fun, you can have that all the time. And actually, we know from lots of research, and TfL's done some great research into this, that the main reason why people cycle is not because it's cheap or it gets you healthy. It's because it's fun, and actually that's the reason. And if an e-bike is the way that we can transmit that fun to a wider group of people, then clearly that's something worth doing. And I think you're seeing huge sales in Germany, which includes e-bikes in some of their sort of scrappage schemes. So it's clear that there's actually a very significant hinterland of the population that would be willing to give this a go. And I think, you can tell me, Andrew, once you've taken the plunge, I don't think many people look back.
Yeah, no, I've been delighted with my my bicycle to date, and I now have a choice of my e-Brompton or the manual Brompton when I've got a bit more energy. But it's interesting the point you raised there around Germany's approach. That I suppose it is when you're potentially retiring a car that you might then have the capital to spend on 1, 2, or even 3 e-bikes for a family, and so I suppose incentives matter, don't they?
They do, and also I think behaviour change is, I think it would be easier to build a third runway at Heathrow Airport than to achieve mass behaviour change in modal shift across the whole of London. It's a really sticky subject, and I think you need to be able to enact these sorts of interventions at the point where people are questioning their habits. That was part of the idea, I think, behind some of the sort of measures we've seen in the last 12 months. But it was obviously done in the context of where everybody was under extreme stress. And I think that has driven a lot of the response back on these measures, really independent of the merits of them specifically. So getting those behaviour change interventions at points where people are considering their behaviour, I think is really important.
I also wonder sometimes whether those of us that are supportive of these schemes actually give enough time to give voice to our support and make sure that that is logged within these consultation processes. Is that
My apologies, Andrew. I'm afraid I've lost your sound there. So if you've asked me a telling question, I'm afraid that one has faded out. I know that you were interested in making sure that we touched on some of the public transport infrastructure requirements of West London. They were required to see come forward over the next 10, 15 years in order to contribute to Race to Zero. And it's clear that it's really important. I mean, I'm struck by the experience of Paris, which, as we speak right now, has 20 tunnel boring machines whirring away under the outskirts of Paris, making 200 kilometres of new underground surface railway, linking together orbital town centres to sort of create that polycentricity of the city, to allow people to move sustainably between their equivalent of Brent, Harrow, Hillingdon, Hayes, Uxbridge, Hounslow, etc. And if you look at that, and then you come back over to London, then we don't really have anything like that at all. We have Crossrail limping to its opening, which of course will make a huge contribution to public transport capacity, and it will relieve a lot of the existing overcrowded public transport lines like the Central Line and the like. But it probably not deliver a huge amount of modal shift, so it's not really going to save us huge sums of carbon. What would save us huge sums of carbon would be schemes like the West London Orbital, which actually provides a genuine alternative for people to get around their sub-region by private car. So really coming back to, and as a sort of an answer to a challenge that people say to us, they say, you want us to get out of our cars, but we haven't got an alternative. Well, West London Orbital is a good version of that. And there are lots of really good examples of that in West London, which I think is one of the reasons probably why I've spent most of my career working here. So there's no end of opportunities to improve access to Heathrow Airport and to make Heathrow Airport a hub on the ground as well as on the air, a proper interchange, a King's Cross to the west, if you like, linking into your London West Innovation District. And there's also local schemes. I mean, we worked in Hounslow on a relatively simple upgrade to a freight line that would bring the benefit of the Elizabeth line down into the Golden Mile opportunity area. Relatively cheap scheme at about £80 million, and it would increase the number of people that could access that really exciting opportunity area around GSK and Sky and others by 50%. The number of people that could access that area by public transport in an hour would go up by 50% just for that very small link of railway. So there's loads of really exciting opportunities in West London. And if we were in the north of England, I think we'd be in for a good chance with that. We're not, so we have to think more creatively, and that I think maybe comes into the issue of funding that we might touch on later.
Mark, that was fantastic overview, and well covered as my studio connection collapsed there. It's one of the joys of live webcasting, but it sounds like you've given folk a good flavour of what's happening within some of the schemes like the West London Orbital and the Golden Mile line that you've pushed for many years. I suppose what I'm always struck by is that in West London, sort of close to Hanger Lane, we actually built one of the first bits of cycle track in the UK, but we do still have an awful lot of gaps in our network. What would your reckoning be of how much we actually need to raise and spend to get a comprehensive cycle network across North West London?
It's a simple question, Andrew, but it's actually quite a difficult thing to work out. And there's lots of things going on there which have a play on it. So the most expensive thing when you're building cycle networks is if you have to cut or widen into the footway, because that's where all your statutory utilities are. And you basically add a naught to the cost of your scheme if you start having to move virgin fibre optic cables and the like around. If you were to go to a scheme which I know relatively well, Chiswick High Road, and you saw the temporary scheme that has been put in there at the moment, that has been implemented at pace, so it hasn't had any of those changes made, and it's used the existing carriageway space. And it was able to do that partly because the traffic demand was significantly suppressed during the pandemic. Now, what we don't know is what's going to happen in the next sort of 5-6 years about traffic demand in London, because if we can build our cycle tracks within our existing carriageways, actually the amount of funding that we would need to create a very comprehensive West London cycle network is relatively small. If we go back to trying to accommodate all of them alongside the existing capacity that we give to vehicular traffic, then, well, one, that is difficult, and two, it is very expensive. So we could be talking the difference between, say, 100, 150 million pounds for something pretty exciting across West London and maybe £1 billion. So, that's the kind of issue. And then, of course, there's how much pace do you want to do it at? If you want to do it at pace, things cost more. If you want to sort of take a bit more time and plan this stuff out, then you can do stuff a little bit cheaper often, a bit more efficiently. But then we are in a race to zero, and race to zero by its very nature means pace, doesn't it?
And would you say that, I mean, we've, I think, had a sense for a few years now that the West London Orbital is probably going to need something in the region of 400 million of investment, and there's a lot of focus now on how do you raise that 400 million despite some of the challenges that TfL are faced with. Do you think there's a need for us to start to get a better handle for the safe cycling infrastructure on whether it is 150 million or more, to focus minds on that fundraising piece in the same way as rail?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you can put a lot of cycle lane for 400 million, but the reality is, I think that is not the whole solution to race to zero for for transport in West London. You need to have that public transport, and particularly those orbital transport solutions to get people out of their cars and really deliver race to zero. So, I mean, what would probably be helpful is if we were able to monetize some of the benefits of cycling, maybe in a bit more hard-nosed way, and be able to bring in private investment into that, in the way that, say, Hounslow did with their PFI for their highways maintenance scheme, because looking at the challenges that we have in the sort of fiscal environment, and by that I mean both the Exchequer's availability of funding, but also the focus on levelling up and moving funding to the north. London is not in a very good place to secure funding for any infrastructure, and I think that, and particularly infrastructure like cycling, which doesn't have a revenue stream associated with it, or not a direct revenue stream. At least with West London Orbital, you do get some income from fares. So I think that's the challenge. It probably needs to be dovetailed a bit with some other policy, part of the policy soup, as I used to call it, around encouraging behaviour change and modal shift. So stuff like workplace parking levy has a particular role to play, obviously made a little bit more tricky with the changes in habits of people travelling to the office. And of course, you're seeing interest in road user charging now, partly driven by the fact that the Exchequer is losing all the money from electric vehicles and the road tax associated. So there are some interesting proposals there, and you've seen that the mayor's come out with the idea of a boundary charge. None of these things are easy, but I think realistically, if we want to see significant investment in London, that they are going to be needed, because it's not going to come from the public Exchequer, from what I can see.
Really interesting reflections, and I think probably some points there for us to come back to on a future programme, and sort of unpack more fully. I'm going to bring Rowan, my colleague, in to see whether we've got perhaps an initial question for the panel from our viewers.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions here. I'll start with one to Juliane. Where does most work need to be done along the restaurant supply chain when hoping to achieve net zero?
It's a really good question, and I think there's a bit of a data gap that we need to be looking at in terms of actual farm level data to understand emissions at UK farm level. We're still drawing from less specific data when we are calculating supply chain emissions for most hospitality. We know that we need to do quite a lot of work to reduce our meat consumption and our dairy consumption in order to reduce the emissions in our supply chain. We need to change the demand for the amount of meat and dairy that we're consuming. Alongside that, we I guess need to be thinking fully from farm to fork when we are calculating the emissions of restaurants. We've gotten quite a few businesses over the years that have created emission strategies that are really just looking at operations. And I think now is the time that we need to be looking beyond just operations to that supply chain and how you can change. We've also seen quite a lot of restaurants that are doing amazing work in bringing ingredients that are traditionally grown outside of the UK and need to be flown in. So particularly something like basil that needs to be flown in when it is grown outside of the UK because it's quite fragile, to bringing that into a local operation. So Pizza Pilgrims, a London small independent business, has done quite a lot of work on their basil to ensure that it's now all being grown in London itself, and has cut quite a lot of emissions from their supply chain by doing so.
Well, that question was a perfect segue into our third and final theme of the morning, and getting more into these sector-based perspectives. Because I suppose, whilst getting the infrastructure that Mark talked about in place and supported behaviour changes is critical, in a sense that perhaps some of this private sector community action to enable net zero is maybe more in our immediate control. Now, I know, Juliane, on my travels, I've come across your Food Made Good framework. I think we're going to bring that up on screen now as a reminder to folk of where to find more information. I wonder whether you can tell us a bit more about what's involved in that, but maybe also this new net zero restaurant protocol that you mentioned to me earlier. How do they fit together?
Yeah, absolutely. So just a quick intro to the SRA and who we are. We are a membership organization that works with hospitality businesses to drive a sustainable future for the hospitality industry. Now, we define sustainability as being quite holistic. We're talking about the supply chain and the food on your plate. We're also talking about the environmental impact of the operations of the restaurant itself. And we're also talking about the social impact of a restaurant and the way that restaurants treat their people and their wider community. So when we are pointing to the Food Made Good framework, there is quite a lot more in it beyond just a net zero strategy, as there's quite a lot more involved in creating a sustainable future for the sector beyond just looking at emissions. Now, that being said, emissions and cutting emissions from food is absolutely essential in us reaching our net zero targets globally, and specifically here in the UK. It's something that often hasn't been talked about in the same way that transport or energy have been. But we will not move forward with achieving those goals if we don't start to unpack the emissions that are within the food sector. So with that being said, we at the SRA, working in collaboration with some other organizations, have been working to launch a net zero restaurant protocol. This simplifies the process for small independent restaurants to calculate their emissions, to get a sense of the carbon hotspots, helps to calculate science-based targets for them based on what we need to do to achieve our goals, helps point towards offsetting solutions in the meantime, and gives restaurants a robust strategy to work towards. We believe that we don't need to wait until there is clearer plans. We believe that the private sector can really be leading in this. We know that there are some restaurants out there that have been doing amazing work. This isn't in the SME space, but one that comes to mind is the work that Nando's has been doing lately and has published in terms of their targets and emissions plans. Brewdog is another great example of a UK business, hospitality business, that has really been leading the way in terms of not only publishing their emissions, setting science-based targets, and taking action both throughout their supply chain to reduce. So, and
I'm assuming the protocol that you mentioned, Juliane. I'm assuming you talked about the need for these things to be fairly easy for hospitality businesses. Is it going to be pretty straightforward for folk to follow?
Exactly. The aim is for it to be very straightforward. So, giving hospitality essentially the spreadsheets that they need to fill out in order to look at their operations, to look at the emissions of their supply chain and their procurement. It gives them, handholds them that they need to collect and how those things need to be inputted and calculated so that you don't have to do that work yourself. We also believe that sometimes the lack of data can lead to businesses not taking any action. And we don't think that needs to be the case. There are, workarounds. If you don't know the exact emissions from your food waste, for example, we can help to calculate that based on sector averages that give you a sense of where to start and what you need to do, without needing to feel that you can't start on this journey until you have all of the answers. That does
sound like takes a bit of the pain away. And you're looking towards a sort of summertime launch, but potentially interested in West London businesses that might get involved in a pilot as you're testing the tool.
Absolutely. So we are looking for a summertime launch of the tools to be available for restaurants to essentially do it themselves. But we are here and ready to start working with businesses and handhold them through that process. We're excited to be working with West London businesses and a number of other businesses up and down the country that are ready to get started and take action on becoming net zero.
And for businesses that haven't yet started, Juliane, because we've been, I think the SRA has been operating for probably a good decade or so, and we've been talking about these issues for several decades. What do you think's stopping them? Is it cost, or are businesses in fact just quietly getting on with it? What's happening out there?
So there was recently some data post-pandemic that said that was published to say that 60% of hospitality and restaurant businesses have said that they do have some form of a net zero strategy or sustainability strategy in place. Now, to me, those numbers seem a bit inflated, especially if you're saying a kind of net zero or emissions reduction strategy. So there is a mix, I guess. There are some that are getting on with it, but I also think that there are a lot of things on the laundry list of running a restaurant, and sometimes things that are hard fall to the bottom. And so we are really here to handhold businesses and help them raise the profile, raise the priorities of some of these sustainability targets, and to understand that they can do it.
And whilst you're not allowed favourites as the head of a membership organisation, you name check Nando's and Brewdog as being perhaps relatively guilt free. Any other favourites that we should be looking out for?
Oh, there are way too many favorite is a tricky term, and there are way too many restaurants to name. If you go to foodmadegood.org, we do have a membership directory where you can check out all of our members. A West London small business that really comes to mind is Darwin and Wallace, and the work that they have been doing, not just on emissions reductions, but across on their supply chain, on the quality, on the way that they treat their people. That jumps out to me. I mentioned Pizza Pilgrims earlier, and the way that they are thinking about how to take ingredients that they would be traditionally getting from Italy, and some of those being fragile ingredients that need to be air freighted, and bringing that supply chain into the UK. I think that's quite admirable. And there are way too many to name. So I do.
That's lots for us to be guessing on Google and looking up. And I thought a very, very diplomatic response there. Now I'm going to bring Simon in because whilst local authorities across London have been recognising the climate emergency, we've had the government in fact scrap the Green Homes Grant scheme just months after they launched it, and weeks before they announced the world's most ambitious reduction targets yet. So I wonder, Simon, what's your take on where the industry now finds itself, and particularly, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the retrofit challenge, because we've got an awful lot of buildings that aren't going to be demolished and rebuilt before these targets need to be achieved. Simon.
Completely agree. I think. Is it a question of the government still, stating all these wonderful targets, but actually not coming up with a plan to achieve them? As the abolition of the Green Home Grant is a case in point, which seemed like a very sensible approach, but they didn't really set up the information or the supply chain to make it happen. I think just to comment on new build, I think that everyone in authority, local authority, and the wider government are trying to make sure that the regulations will create buildings that will get to net zero. Building regs are still behind the curve, and even systems like Passive House are not where they need to be in order to get to net zero. I think you've highlighted particularly to us the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea's new greening SPD, which I think we may bring up on screen as one that perhaps stands out for you as good practice. Yes. So I think this is a really good example of moving on to your retrofit question. Obviously, boroughs like RBKC are largely built and established, and they have also a lot of conservation areas and listed buildings. So they've come up with this quite comprehensive guide to how you can upgrade and improve your own home. And it's a very, very clear document, and it explains all the technologies that are available in order for individuals, in effect, to upgrade their properties. I think we're involved with a small estate within the borough, and it's quite interesting when you test the policies against the design and conservation policies, because clearly upgrading existing properties, particularly heat pumps, are always mentioned. Air source heat pumps are the way forward, but they take up quite a lot of room. Although they're quiet, they do make a noise. So in an existing densely populated borough, as most of London is, where do you site them? How do you get consent for them? And then even when you do, you probably have to change all your heating system internally, because the temperature coming out of the heat pumps is so low, you have to have larger surface areas in order to get the heating to work. And or you have to upgrade the fabric, and there again, it's quite challenging to upgrade the fabric externally sometimes in conservation areas. So you have to go internally, then you lose floor space. But there are some very exciting materials being developed, high-tech materials like thermogels, which not only are very thin internal materials, but they also let the properties breathe, because that's one of the key issues about upgrading your insulation, your fabric, is that if you put it on the outside, you often get condensation issues in the fabric. So it is a minefield, and I will plug your Race to Zero website, because I think that's exactly what people need. They need access to good, simple information in order to make this transition, to make it easy and simple for people to make this happen.
And of course, I mean, that the high level, it can of course be simplified, and the level of complexity varies sector by sector, business by business. But there is, to some extent, in your profession, Simon, no getting away from some of the technological complexities. I think you've highlighted the whole life cycle carbon assessment that RICS has developed, and I just wonder whether you want to talk us through that.
Well, I think that there are a couple of slides just to really highlight how much energy goes into making a building, to then running the building, and then actually the kind of operations around the building. And RICS have gone on to develop a guide to carry out your carbon assessment. And I would imagine that you probably have something similar on your website. But the starting point is, thank you, the starting point is to work out what your carbon footprint is now, and then to work out a way to reduce it. So you need your starting point, and then in any project you need to have an assessment system in order to make sure you get to your carbon net zero.
So there's a kind of sort of process flow now that RICS professionals and I suppose supported by our IBA colleagues need to be following on projects. I think if we flip back to the previous slide with those sort of pie charts, I suppose what's really striking there is that those sort of dark purple sort of slices of the pies, whether it's offices, warehouses, or residential, those are the carbon emissions involved in the build process, the embodied carbon, which is a strikingly large amount.
It is huge, and of course that also is a big plus for retrofit, because obviously if a building is up and already the fabric is basically there, you should try and work with that if possible, and bring it up to date or convert it to a new use wherever possible.
Now, I always sort of like to actually find some schemes that we can hopefully very soon go and look at in practice. And I think there are two photos here, and we'll bring up the first. Do you want to talk us through these particular projects and why you felt they should be spotlighted?
Yeah, I think just very briefly, this is the Peel development, South Kilburn in London Borough of Brent. I think the key issue here was that there was a master plan, but we redesigned it for Brent with countryside properties, and it's this kind of stay local issue about carbon reduction. So if you make good places where people can come and they can shop, they can go to their community use, whether it's the doctor, the dentist, they can stay local. They don't have to get in their car and go far. And also by greening spaces, you can obviously make a big difference to carbon emissions in the UK as a whole. So that was really the purpose of showing this particular development.
And then the other scheme, which is going to come up now.
Yeah, the other one is in Westminster, and this is a passive house scheme. And this is where I think local authorities, where they're in control of their estates, and also registered providers, they are really leading the way because they know they have a long-term investment. So this comes back to whole carbon life cycle costing, where we're not just looking at the next 5 years, the return on investment, you're looking at the next 40, 50 years. And that's where, as I say, local councils, registered providers have that long-term interest to make sure that you have well-insulated, good energy management. The issue now facing new construction is overheating. Buildings are now so well insulated that they're overheating, and then you have to spend energy in cooling them. So part of the new regulations that are coming out in beginning of 2022 are assessments of overheating to minimize overheating and minimize any energy required to get rid of that overheating problem.
I think passive house, which you sort of mentioned in passing there, a standard that we probably all need to get more familiar with, and sort of when we're buying homes, be cognizant of the high standards of that set. But equally, I suppose, to some of our young people considering setting out on a career in the industry, a useful skill set to acquire passive house knowledge.
Absolutely, it's all common sense. My only slight concern about it is the simpler the shape, the more efficient the building. So, but we don't want to end up in just big square boxes. So the challenge for designers is to still make beautiful buildings that are very low carbon.
Very, very important point there. We probably have time for one more question from our viewers. So I'm going to bring Rowan back in for a question to the panel.
Yep, of course. Actually, this is more of a broad question. What are WLB's plans for COP26 / anything to do with better futures and the SDGs?
Okay, well, I think on that, I'm going to bring Jane in to sort of give a bit of a flavour of some of the things that are planned for the months ahead, whilst it is, of course, a bit of a work in progress still. Jane.
Yes, so we're planning on doing a roadshow with the 7 boroughs, and we're planning on having a stall at COP26 to promote the work that we're doing. It's very much a work in progress at the moment, but I think very exciting. We'll be promoting the Better Futures Plus program and looking to expand that. And also, obviously, there's the Race to Zero page. We're going to be trying to garner as many businesses to sign up on that as possible in the run-up.
And that I suppose is the crux of it, is getting businesses both making those pledges, but then also ensuring that where local businesses need support, they know that they can turn to us to connect with the experts, isn't it?
Exactly, yes. So we are very happy to connect you with the right people to help you on your sustainability journey. Just get in contact with us, and we're more than happy to help.
Well, yes, on that note, as always, the hour has just flown by, and there was so much more I would have loved to have probed our panellists on, but perhaps that's the opportunity for the months ahead in the run-up to COP26 is to get into more detail on some of the themes from today's conversation. A huge thank you to our production team, Joel at Revolution Audio and Rowan at West London Business. Thank you to our guests, Juliane Caillouette Noble, Managing Director at the Sustainable Restaurant Association. Thank you to Simon Child, Director at Child Graddon Lewis Architects and Design. Mark Frost, Director at Fern Consulting and Chair of the Transport Planning Society, as well as my colleague Jane Mossman, Project Manager at Better Futures Plus. As always, continue to share your thoughts with us and visit coronavirus.westlondon.com for the latest information and support. To speak to a member of the team about your concerns, or indeed the Net Race to Zero campaign that we launched today, call 020-8607-2500. If you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, please click on the button below the video stream to stay informed and show your support for our work. Talk at 10 will be back next month, exploring the esports boom across West London and beyond. Until then, as always, we wish you, your friends, family and colleagues good health, and please maintain social distancing wherever possible to stay safe.